All right, it is an absolutely beautiful day out here, so I thought, why not do a lesson outside as I'm walking? So for this lesson, I would like to talk about two things. One we've already talked about, and that's conflict, but I want to go into a little more detail. Then the second thing I want to talk about is climax. Now, it's hard to talk about those two things without talking about rising action and complications, which we've already talked about. But let's talk about Max swings to the fences. I'm saying let's talk about quite a bit. But we've gotten to the point where Max tells that lie, and that's when the rising action starts. That's when the complications start. Now notice I'm using those two words interchangeably because complications is part of rising action. And rising action, complications, is when life gets more difficult for the main character. And that's when the conflict should start. That means we need to talk about certain types of conflict. And just to let you know, the climax is usually where that conflict ends. That's how all of those things are related. But I would argue, now I didn't write this short story, so the author might have a different opinion, or you, the reader, might have a different opinion, but I think I can back up with a lot of evidence that the type of conflict in Max Swings to the Fences is something that we call person versus self. Person versus self, because Max starts the conflict by telling the lie. Now, some people reading this might think it's person versus person, and you might think like it's Max versus Molly or something like that, but it's not. In my opinion, it's Max versus himself. Oh, because he tells that lie, he is the one that creates the conflict for him. Now, I don't want to spoil too much because we haven't gotten to that part in the book. Molly could be considered a complication. I'll just leave it at that for now. Maybe I'll talk more about that later. But let's talk about some other types of conflict. We talked about person versus person. That's when you have two people that are having a conflict with each other. May start getting a little loud here with the traffic. Maybe I'll turn around. Then you have person versus self. So that means that person is having some sort of conflict, but they're the reason that conflict started. Person versus self. Maybe I should walk backwards so the sun is shining down on me. I'm gonna walk. You don't need to see my face, right? I'm gonna walk like this. The next thing I'd like to talk about is person versus nature. And this is a pretty easy one to understand. That's when you have your protagonist, your main character, and the antagonist, the thing that causes the conflict, is something natural. So it might be a volcano, it might be an earthquake, it might be a tsunami. Who knows? Anything natural. And I would include animals in that. So if it's a survival story, and then like the bear, or Jaws. You guys familiar with Jaws? Jaws. You have a shark. You would say that that's probably man or person versus nature. Now we could go supernatural as well. So think of natural, nature, something of this earth. Supernatural is not of this earth. So you might have something like, well, Halloween's coming up, so maybe some witches that are not from this world. Supernatural. The book that we read next is actually, or the short story, is actually going to be person versus supernatural. Probably. Maybe person versus self. But we'll talk more about Mr. Shockey when we get to Mr. Shockey. There's also another one called person versus technology. And you might experience this when you're learning remotely. Maybe for some reason the internet isn't working with you, or maybe for some reason your cell phone has died. You could say that that's person versus technology. But then if your cell phone's dying, maybe you weren't very responsible when you forgot to plug it in. So then maybe we could blame you. Maybe it's actually person versus self because you're the one that forgot. So some of these, like I said, if you can provide evidence for it from what you're reading in the text, sometimes you can argue, no, that's person versus technology, it's person versus self, that's person versus supernatural. I will mention that quite a bit in this class, that unlike math, where you always have like one answer, 4 plus 4 is 8, right? In English class, if you find the evidence in the text, then you could possibly come up with a different answer than somebody else. Maybe for, I think Max swings for the fences might be a little tough, but they might find some evidence where, you know, Molly is the actual antagonist. I don't think they could, but I'm pretty sure of my answer being Max versus himself for this, because he's the one that told the lie. But in other things, we can find different answers, and that's a really well written story. If two different people can find a different answer and prove it, that's a really well written story. Let's use hopefully 2 things, maybe 3 things that you're very familiar with. 1, Toy Story, one of my favorite movies of all time. If we had to go with conflict, I think we'd say person versus person, or toy versus toy. It's Buzz and Woody. But the climax comes when Buzz and Woody are no longer fighting. It probably would happen sometime in Sid's room when they come to an understanding. Like, that's the climax. You could argue that maybe it comes right at the end, because when we're talking about movies, there are usually more than one conflict that drives it. Maybe it's Buzz trying to get back to Andy. And then if that's the way you're thinking, the climax would come much later. What if we're talking about the Avengers? I love talking about that. And you have pretty much all the Avengers against Thanos. Well, the climax, if that's the conflict, the climax is when Thanos is defeated. This isn't the last time we'll talk about conflict. There are a few others that I want to introduce you to. Maybe you remember them from 5th and 6th grade, but we'll talk more about that. Right now, I'd like to talk about climax. Remember, climax is the big, usually 3/4 to almost all the way to the end. On some of the charts that you'll see English teachers show you about plot diagrams, we call them, the climax is usually in the middle. And that's not the case. The climax usually comes at the end. And I will make another video where I talk more about that plot diagram. But climax, the majority of the time, that is when the conflict ends. And it usually comes towards the end. And we'll talk about denouement and falling action next week. But climax is usually when the conflict ends. Climax is when the conflict ends.